Afternoon. My name is Wolfgang HILLER. I'm Director in the European Parliament Research Service. I would like to welcome you to this virtual event on taxing multinationals in Europe and worldwide. Before we start, I would like to inform you that this event is web streamed and recorded. The event is organized jointly with the International Monetary Fund, and we are very happy that the IMF has agreed to join forces with us today. Relations between the European Parliament and the IMF are solid, but such an event as today makes those ties even stronger. Today, the IMF will share with us its thinking on taxing multinationals and how to make tax systems fairer and more sustainable. The IMF recently also held a conference on the same subject with the European Economic and Social Committee, which shows the importance the IMF allocates to this issue. In any case, taxation is an issue of great relevance, and the debate is today very timely. We know governments care about taxes because they need money to fund their activities. Taxes are, of course, also important for companies and citizens because they have to pay them. Moreover, taxes, so necessary in principle, may distort competition and may thus have negative effects on fair and sound economic development. Most importantly, however, taxation is also an important element in the context of good public governance, as either it can build trust between governments and citizens, or it can destroy it, depending on the actual context. Well, there is mounting global awareness that in particular the current system for taxing multinational corporations is no longer fit for purpose, mainly because of increasing international profit shifting and intense tax competition between jurisdictions. For these reasons, it is essential that governments find appropriate and global solutions to this problem. We are aware of the work in the past, notably also within the OECD framework, and it seems that thanks to a new US administration, progress now seems to be possible. EPRS will follow these developments with great attention, and we therefore plan to hold a second event on the same issue later in the autumn, together with the OECD, at a moment when OECD member states may hopefully be in a position to actually agree on an international agreement or shortly before. A lot of work, however, still needs to be done, which makes today's event important and, as I said before, timely. Timely also because the IMF has just published a study on exactly the subject of today's debate, and we are extremely happy that we are among the first ones to learn about their findings and recommendations. The authors of this report, KLEMM, Division Chief of the IMF's Tax Policy Division, and Erik, former Assistant Director of the Fund's European Department, will shortly present the study. This will be followed by comments from Laura van Daniels, who is the head of the Americas Division of the German Institute for International Security Affairs, Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin, and Liz Nelson, the director of the Tax Justice Network, where she leads a program of collaboration between tax justice and human rights initiatives of practical application. My colleague Angelo Stellivorias, policy analyst in our EPRS Economic Policies Unit, will moderate the remainder of the event. Before that, I would, however, like to warmly welcome Mr. Paul Tang, the chair of the European Parliament's Subcommittee on Taxation, who will set the scene by introducing the subject from the point of view of the European Parliament. Mr. Tang is a member of the Parliament since 2014. He is from the Netherlands, and apart from chairing the Parliament's Subcommittee on Taxation, he is also, inter alia, a member of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs and the Delegation for Relations with the United States. He studied economics at the University of Amsterdam and worked for the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs and the Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis before entering the Dutch Parliament in 2007. As you can see, Mr. Tang is a proven expert in the field of economic affairs, and we are very delighted that he has accepted our invitation to speak to us today. Mr. Tang, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wolfgang, and I'm delighted to be in this meeting. I very much like the idea that we have this conference on a European level where we discuss what needs to be discussed. And this is one of the aims that we also have with the FIS committee in the European Parliament. It's perhaps the only parliament in Europe that's really dedicated to what I could say European and international tax issues. But we very much like to be also a hub in the European discussion, finding that we lack the discussion and bring information by being a hub in the European discussion throughout Europe. And I see this conference fits right into this aim. And central to this conference is a study by the IMF, which I also find very important. But let make this a bit personal. I work with one of the co-authors of the report in my younger research years. That was Ruud Mooi, and working with him must be in early 2000s. We discussed several issues, among them tax competition. So I had early on an understanding of the tax competition. What are the developments? What are the driving forces behind it? So when I entered Dutch politics, indeed in 2006, 2007, it was one of the issues I wanted to bring to Dutch politics, and that I now try to bring to the European Parliament. And it just shows how important a good understanding is, and how good analytical study can help people change their mind and see the developments and the driving forces behind those developments. That's extremely valuable. So it's not a particular incident or accident that kicked me in this direction. It was a very intellectual discourse among researchers that helped me to get me fired up to work on tax issue, and especially on tax competition. And in that sense, I think the report is very valuable to make people understand what is going on and what can be done to change it. And of course, as you could say, as a former researcher, I totally agree that we need more research. That's the usual conclusion from any research. We need more research, and definitely this is what we sometimes lack in the European discussion. Sometimes the facts, the analysis of the facts, the consequences of different policy options. I'm very used to that in the Dutch policy setting, the setting for policymakers and politicians, where we have analysis from the Central Planning Bureau, where I used to work on what are the policy options and how, so that as politician and policymaker can weigh that option. That is sometimes poorly lacking in the debate on European and international taxation. And I give you an example. When I was working co-rapporteur on the CCCTB, the consolidated common corporate tax base, together with my French colleague, I was so appalled that we didn't have always the right data to have a good analysis. And Alain Lamassoure and I traveled throughout Europe to make a plea for the CCCTB in the capitals. We didn't stay in Brussels. We moved out to various capitals to discuss this with, among others, members of national parliament, who are usually less informed than the European Parliament. But everywhere we went, we encountered people that thought, well, perhaps it's a good proposal, but we will lose from it. That was the general setting. So every country we went, they assumed that they would lose from it. And that's just show that the whole debate has become fact-free, and everyone can have its opinion. That's why I still like to think that even in this day and age, facts and good analysis still can make a difference. So therefore, more research is needed. We need to start to build databases and have good analysis. And like I said, this was also the reason why I very much value this conference and the study by the IMF. One element of the study itself very clearly shows that there is an ongoing race to the bottom, right? It also shows that, very clearly shows that profits are shifted. That you can see by comparing multinational, foreign multinationals and domestic firms. Clearly shows that foreign multinationals tend to have their profits in jurisdictions with low tax rates. What I also find very interesting is that we have the spillovers. I think that's also something that should be explored much further. In that sense, that a tax construction in one country or lowering a tax rate in one country has an impact on the other European countries, and this goes to the heart of the European cooperation, right? And that we are European partners, and yet we allow national tax systems that, I have no other word for it, that rob our other European partners, our neighbors, from their tax revenue. The profit shifting and base erosion is to the detriment of our European partners, and that is, I think, always a very strong argument, and it helps very much if research and studies can show to what extent that happens, because it's difficult that on the one hand we cooperate and the other hand we steal from each other. This is a message that the member states don't always like to hear. Like I said, I started my political career in the Netherlands, and I'm still vocal in the Netherlands. In fact, I'm one of the members of the European Parliament that made sure that the Netherlands was on the list of tax havens, as that has been reported by the European Parliament. But then again, it's not always a message that fits well with the national self-image, but you have to make people aware. And I can see I've been doing this for quite some time, that the awareness in the Netherlands is growing, and that many people nowadays think find it very normal when you say the Netherlands is tax haven, right? So, because the message is not always easy, it doesn't mean that it doesn't come across. In fact, and the reason is that the Dutch have become aware that they are also imposing a cost on their European partners, and that is that. In the end, for a politician like me, it is to translate the research, the studies, the analysis, also to these bottom lines. You don't rob from your neighbors. Very simple. And this is what makes me optimistic on the time to come. Also, what I find in the political spectrum, and also why the cooperation in the new subcommittee on fiscal affairs, fiscal matters is relatively easy. We have something in common, and that's a basic notion of fairness. Everyone has to pay its share. So every time it is shown that a corporate or a very wealthy person doesn't pay its taxes, people take offense to that. And that is a notion of fairness that is shared across the political spectrum. I truly believe that by informing the public and raising public awareness and creating therefore political pressure, we can make a change, because we share the same notion of fairness across the political spectrum. May I add to that indeed this is a very interesting time with the OECD negotiations that have to come to a conclusion, and with the new American proposals on the table. But it also shows there's not only that fairness is driving changes in the tax system, but also that we need the need for revenue. Joe Biden is very clear. He wanted to invest to sustain the recovery. He wants to invest to make the recovery sustainable, and therefore you need money. And that is very different from the previous crisis, the global financial crisis, when we were thinking about to balance the government budgets by cutbacks, and there was discussion on the need for reforms. Nowadays, I think it's a very different discourse, and we need to invest That's the thinking, current thinking, on both sides of the Atlantics. But to have this investment, we need to finance that. And what better place to start than with those corporate polluters or persons that do not pay their fair share right now. So this is also why the taxation will be high on the agenda, not just now in the coming months with the OECD, but I expect the taxation to be high on the agenda of policymakers and politicians in the years to come. So I would very looking forward to having more of this meeting, more of these studies, because this is a time of change, and I still think and believe that having the facts, having good analysis, having good studies, will change the public and political debate in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tang, for your contribution. Let us now move to the two colleagues from the IMF. Short presentation. The study was made by Alexander KLEMM and Erik VRIJER, who have joined us both. Alexander KLEMM is Division Chief of the Tax Policy Division of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, where he undertakes research and leads capacity development of tax policy. He has also worked in other departments of the IMF, participating both in financial programs and economic surveillance. Outside the IMF, he has also gained experience in other places such as the Institute for Fiscal Studies or the European Central Bank. Mr. KLEMM holds a PhD from University College London and has published on public finance, tax policy, investment, and the balance of payments. Sorry, I just wanted to, I received a message that Mr. Tang might have to leave shortly. So I wonder whether, is there any question that we could maybe address directly to Mr. Tang before we move on? I apologize. I got the news in real time. I don't see anything. Apologies. Okay, let's move on then.
No, sorry. And just for the audience, there is an unexpectedly a committee meeting on sustainable finance that I need to join. I'm terribly sorry for that, but I have to leave in a short while.
Understood. And Mr. de Vries recently retired from the International Monetary Fund, where until a year ago he was assistant director of the fund's European department. He has been mission chief in several European member states. And he had held previous roles with division and mission chief in Middle East and Central Asia Department and African Department, as well as resident technical expert at the Bank of Central African Studies. Prior to joining the International Monetary Fund, Erik de Vries worked as an economist in the domestic research department of the Netherlands Bank. Gentlemen, the floor is yours. And once we finish, I will present the discussants. Thank you.
Okay, let me start by thanking you for giving us the opportunity to to discuss our paper, which in fact is based on sort of a number of years of work in our fiscal affairs department on profit taxation, corporate profit taxation, but also in area departments like the European department, where since 2016 we've focused much more on sort of macro relevant profit tax issues. And the motivation for our paper, let me start with that. After being in place for about a century, there is increasing awareness that the corporate income tax system is no longer fit for purpose. The main problems relate to sort of growing international spillovers, resulting in significant revenue losses. These spillovers work through tax competition between countries, Mr. Tang already mentioned that, and also cross-border profit shifting by multinational enterprises. In addition to these problems, there has been a notable increase in digital trade cross-border, which intensifies, in fact, the debate on how to allocate and where to allocate the overall tax base of multinationals among the relevant jurisdictions. In the current system, it is supposed to be fairly easy to decide where production takes place and relate also taxing rights to physical presence. And with the digital activities, all these distinctions become more and more blurred. So altogether, this has led to increased public dissatisfaction with a perceived unfairness in profit taxation. This unfairness about how much tax is paid and where the tax is paid. Finally, recently, the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is putting severe stress on public finances in many countries, underlining the importance of an efficient corporate profit tax system. Our paper intends to contribute to the European policy debate on corporate income tax reform in three ways. First, we review the performance of the corporate income tax in Europe over the past several decades, and we also look at the important role played by multinationals. That sets the stage, so to speak. The second, we analyze these corporate tax spillovers in Europe with a particular focus on the channels, the ways in which it happens, and the size, the magnitudes of both profit shifting and corporate tax competition. And finally, in the third part, we look at progress made in European corporate income tax coordination, and we discuss reforms options, and we try to be fairly specific in order to effectively reduce both tax competition and profit shifting. Let me start then by looking at the corporate income tax performance and a bit closer. And if you can look here at the right-hand chart, you can see that there is a clear declining trend in statutory corporate income tax rates since 2000. And this reflects a variety of factors, but it is also a telling sign of international tax competition, in particular also within Europe. Despite these declining rates, if you look at the left-hand chart, you see that corporate income tax is still an important, remains an important revenue category, about 3% of GDP in 2018 on average, with fairly large sort of a variety around this level. And it has been also, if you look back, fairly constant since 2000, if you take account of the effect of the business cycle. The reasons why this CIT revenue has remained somewhat stable are, on the one hand, the rising share of corporate profits in GDP that we document in the paper, and also some base broadening, in particular in earlier years. On the next chart, we look closer at the relationship between the CIT statutory rate and corporate gross operating surplus, let's say corporate profits. And you can see indirectly evidence of this tax competition, but also profit shifting. The left-hand chart shows a clear negative association between the CIT rate and corporate profits share in GDP, which indicates tax competition, but also profit shifting as countries try to make their own tax systems relatively attractive compared to others. On the right-hand chart, you see the relationship between, let's say, the ratio of CIT revenue and corporate profits, which are the green bars, which is a measure of the average tax rate paid on reported profits. And that is clearly much below the statutory profit tax rate. And this difference reflects policy choices made by governments on the corporate tax base, and is also an element of making your tax system relatively attractive. In the next chart, we put together some key facts on multinationals to show that they account for a large part of real economic activity in Europe. In fact, they contribute about 20% of value added in the EU, but significantly more, as you can see on the left side of the chart, in several countries. And they also contribute significantly to employment and substantially to corporate profits. On the right-hand chart, you see that of the 500 largest multinationals worldwide, about 142 are European ones, and they are particularly important in the financial sector, energy, and motor vehicle sectors, but less so in the technology sector. Europe also plays a very important role in global foreign direct investment, with an important part played by so-called special purpose entities in several countries. The number of enterprises engaged in cross-border digital sales in Europe has been significantly on the rise in recent years. Now, there is empirical evidence that multinational profits are taxed less than their domestic peers, with purely domestic companies, and also that affiliates of multinationals report lower profitability, but that at the consolidated group level, the after-tax profits are relatively high. If we now look a bit closer into these corporate tax spillovers, you can basically distinguish between, let's say, base spillovers and strategic spillovers. Base spillovers reflect the impact of a country's tax policy through responses by firms on the tax basis of other countries, in particular from impacts on real investment and profit shifting. The impact on real investment is significant. The meta-analysis that we report in the paper indicate that a 10% reduction in the average effective tax rate on profits increases the stock of foreign direct investment on average and in the long term by about more than 30%, which is a significant effect. The impact on real investment, there, of course, country size matters. Very small countries are less important in this regard. That's different. Country size matters much less for the impact on profit location or profit shifting. And multinationals use various tax planning devices to shift taxable income from high to low tax jurisdictions. We'll come to that. Strategic spillovers are broader and result from the impact of a country's policy choices of tax changes on abroad, on a country. So tax policy through jurisdictions, by jurisdictions, which eventually could lead to suboptimal low CIT rates. Here also we quote empirical evidence, namely that a 1% reduction in the average CIT rate in all other countries induces a country on average to reduce its own CIT rate by between 0.35 and 0.75 percentage points. In Europe, because of the close connections between economies, that sort of stimulates corporate tax spillovers within the region compared to regions where these connections are loose. In the next slide, we mention, and we sort of elaborate a bit more on that in the paper, but I would like to sort of go very lightly on this here, on the various tax planning devices that are used to shift income from high to low tax jurisdictions, such as abusive transfer pricing, location of intellectual property through IP boxes, intragroup lending, exploiting mismatches, and others. So let me now move to the estimates that we report on profit shifting. There are two types of studies. One approach would be to look at firm-level data and to try to estimate revenue loss associated with individual profit-shifting strategies, such as abusive transfer pricing. These studies overall suggest relatively modest revenue losses, but they do not really capture all forms of profit shifting, nor do they account for the interaction channels between the different forms of profit shifting. And they also do not capture fully profit shifting to low tax jurisdictions that do not provide the data necessary to do the studies. So these relatively modest revenue losses are probably a lower bound. Studies based on macro data, they try to estimate the relationship or the semi-elasticity of the CIT base with respect to CIT rate differentials, and they estimate it at around 1.5, which is not small. And estimates on global net revenue losses are larger than in the micro studies, and they range between 5 and 23% of CIT revenue. These are net revenue losses, but so they sort of include relatively important effects for tax base losers and tax base winners. Then moving to tax competition, we have here two charts that on the left-hand side, you can see that the average CIT rate in Europe dropped from about 35% in 1995 to 21% in 2019, and is now below the OECD average, possibly reflecting large intra-European spillovers from tax competition. To illustrate, we have a sort of a back of the envelope calculation in the report that clearly is based on the assumption that everything else remains equal, and everything else did not remain equal. However, it's still quite illustrative. If the EU 27 countries, plus Norway, Switzerland and the UK, had applied their 1990 CIT rates to their 2018 CIT basis, means reported taxable profits, they would have collected about 1.5% of GDP more in revenues. Now, that is a significant amount, especially if you link it to the 3% on average CAT revenue to GDP ratio that we had in an earlier slide. In the right-hand chart, you can see that tax competition is also reflected in preferential tax regimes with lower tax rates, notably on IP boxes or intellectual property regimes. While there is, and you see a very large difference between the IP box rate, which is the blue column, and the statutory CIT rate, the dots. While there is little evidence that these IP regimes stimulated domestic research and development, and thus productivity growth and economic growth, they have been quite aggressively used to attract profits through attracting IP management. I will stop here and hand over to Alex, who will do the third part of our paper.
Thanks very much, Erik. Now that Erik has given us a good idea of what the problems are, let me try to focus on the solutions and try to get to see how far we can get on those. So the first thing to note is that Europe has been trying for quite a long time to address these problems, although the debate has slightly changed over the decades. So, for example, I mentioned here the European Code of Conduct on Business Taxation. This is something that has been adopted in the 90s, and it was meant to address harmful tax competition, which then had a very precise definition, and we can talk about that later if there's time. What is really interesting is also that often policy in Europe is not driven by these initiatives, but actually by the courts, and this is through the competition policy. So there are these state aid rules. Of course, competition policy is usually about subsidies, but you can use taxes to achieve the same thing that can be done by subsidies, and therefore it falls under these same rules. More recently, there have been a set of directives aimed at reducing the scope for tax avoidance, the two anti-tax avoidance directives, and that automatically leads me to the OECD and the BEPS efforts, because these directives, they actually implement some of these BEPS measures, and sometimes they are stricter than the minimum requirements under the inclusive framework. So in that sense, Europe tries to go a bit further than that, but certainly adopting all of the inclusive framework BEPS minimum actions. These actions I mentioned, they have been agreed in 2015, but the dialogue is ongoing, and there's continued progress on those. The most important one are the blueprints. Here, let me talk briefly only about Pillar 1. We will ignore this for the rest of the presentation. Pillar 1 is an idea to tax some share of profits of some multinationals using a formulary method rather than traditional transfer pricing approaches. The reason we're not going to talk much about it is that it's not going to raise very much, although it is really important in the sense of introducing new concepts and trying them out in practice. Pillar 2 is something that I will pick up various times in this presentation, because Pillar 2 is about a minimum tax. So I can also keep it short, because as soon as it comes, I'll explain it. Important to note on both is that there is hope of consensus in the summer of this year. And if that consensus happens at the inclusive framework of the OECD, clearly that would set the scene for anything happening in Europe too. So what can Europe do in its current situation? It depends a little bit on what the outcome at the inclusive framework is. The first best solution to many of the problems that Erik has described is is global because the problem is global. It's not, it might be more intensive in Europe, but the underlying problem is global. So the ideal solution is also global. But of course, also at the global level, it is more difficult to agree. And you cannot go as far and as deep as at a regional level. And this is where Europe comes in, and where European harmonization can be either an interim measure or it can be a measure on top of any global agreement. So I mentioned already the recent discussions. So let me jump right into it. Minimum tax is really the crucial point. And before going into it, I want to make sure that nobody is confused by the term minimum tax. In Europe, in the early 2000s and so on, people talked already about minimum corporate taxes. And when they said this, they meant that European countries would agree on one rate, which would be the minimum, so no member state would have a rate below that minimum. And very often today, when you hear the word minimum tax, and you're not one of the people who follow this on a daily basis, you might have that in mind. But actually, when we talk about minimum tax now, the debate is involved. This is not at all what people talk about. Instead, the minimum tax is a minimum tax on outbound investment and on inbound investment. So it is not the case that countries need to agree on what they do domestically with their rate. It's more that everybody agrees on how they treat out and inbound flows of investment. I'll give you an example. If there's investment from one country to another, then if that investment is not properly taxed in the country of where it takes place, and then the home country can introduce additional taxation to bring it up to the foreseen minimum tax. And the same applies the other way around. A country that is recipient of foreign investment, if there are flows that reduce the tax base in that country, for example, interest payments, royalty payments, management fees, that recipient country can check if these flows are properly taxed in the other country. And if they are not, they can impose minimum taxation on it or deny the deduction or something equivalent. So it is a mechanism that ensures that minimum tax is paid without actually forcing people to, or countries to adopt minimum taxes domestically. I just wanted to explain this, even though it took 1 or 2 minutes of the presentation. So now that I have explained the concept of minimum taxation, how can that help? Well, first we can note a country can do this unilaterally. There is nothing in international tax law that stops a country from taxing its own companies on their profits abroad. It's always been part of the possibilities. And indeed, the US has done something very similar recently with what they call guilty provision. And the same is true on the other side. So unilateral adoption, it's possible. It reduces the scope for tax avoidance and profit shifting. So it's certainly something countries can contemplate. But if you take it to the European level, it is so much more powerful. So if one country did this, this country would become a very unattractive place to locate the headquarters of a multinational, because being located in that country would mean that you are lumbered with having to deal with all of these minimum taxes on your foreign investment. If all countries, at least all European countries, agree on that, it's much more effective. There are many more companies that would be willing to move from one European member state to another than companies that are willing to completely move out of Europe. So a European minimum tax would be a fundamental change. Of course, a global adoption would still be better. I mean, I say global, but actually it's sufficient if all important large economies agree. So we don't have on this chart figures on aggregate revenue impact. The OECD has published some numbers, but because there has not yet been an agreement on the actual rate and on the base, these numbers can change depending on how the next months play out. The other idea is formulary apportionment. This is the idea that you just lump a multinational's profit together. You don't worry about transfer pricing. You don't worry about allocating profits through the traditional way. Instead, you do it with a simple formula. The formula could be based on capital, based on employment, or based on sales in each member country. This is something that the European Commission has proposed various times over the last decade. So this 2016 proposal listed here is not the first one. It's also not the last, because subsequent to our finishing that paper, they have come with a new proposal. Now it's called BFIT, but it's actually the same underlying philosophy. So if this were adopted, it would greatly reduce profit shifting. However, there would still be tax competition. And this is because the formula is based on real factors such as location of capital and location of labor. So by reducing the tax rate, a country would still make it attractive to put a lot of capital and labor in that country. But now the beauty is it can be combined with the other proposal we discussed on the previous slide. So if there's a minimum tax, that would reduce the pressure for such tax competition. So I have, I think, already covered these points. Just to add that the difficulty in adopting solutions like that is that they will affect each country differently. So we can design a formula with certain weight on capital and certain weight on labor that replicates the revenue for one particular country. But it's, I think, impossible mathematically to design a formula that would keep the revenue the same in all countries. Also, if you think that the current revenues are distorted by tax avoidance flows, it would actually not make sense to do that because you would want to get rid of those flows. So therefore, reaching political agreement on this has been difficult, and this is probably the reason why proposals for this have been floating around for at least 20 years, and they have not been agreed yet. But just to stress, they would be definitely a step in the right direction and be extremely helpful. So let me come to my concluding remarks. I think we're all aware of the race to the bottom. Personally, I mean, we use this word because everybody uses it. I personally would describe it as a slow hike to the bottom because it's a slow process. You know, normally I don't like it when my papers are out of date. Here, I kind of like it because very recently we've seen some countries increasing their rates. So the US is currently contemplating it. The UK might be doing it. So the very, very latest, or actually not latest, but the expected future development could be a turning point, possibly already driven by some of the things we described here, like minimum taxes, which reduce the pressure. Erik discussed at length the M&E tax planning and the impact on revenue losses. Estimates vary widely, but they are certainly not zero. They are large, and that is, so there is an issue. COVID-19 made everything more urgent. I think also this need to have a tax system that is perceived as fair and that includes returns to capital. And clearly, while we have nothing bad to say about everything that has been achieved so far under BEPS and all of these other efforts, it's clearly not enough. So this is basically just to say, I'm not going to repeat it in detail, but both the minimum tax and the common consolidated tax base, or whatever it will be called in the future, they are very effective ways to reduce tax competition and profit shifting, and especially profit shifting in the case of the CCCTB. And both would complement each other. Yeah, I don't have time to go into this destination-based aspect, but one of the aspects of formula reapportionment is that you can put sales into the factor and thereby allocate some of the profits to the country where the consumers are based, and this would thereby also address some of the problems we have in the digital sector. So with an apology for having rushed through this, I hope it gave you a good idea of what the paper is saying. I want to very briefly just mention that beyond that paper, we also look at global developments. We just have a book out that is much, much longer, more than 300 pages, goes into great detail of these issues at a global level. And we will have similar papers to the one we today presented on Asia Pacific and Africa with slightly different focuses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. KLEMM. Thank you, Mr. De Vrijer, for this very interesting presentation. And let me remind our audience that the link to the paper is available in our chat. Let me also remind the audience that contrary to on-site events, they can ask questions by using the Q&A and the chat functionalities. And let me now, yes, at any moment during the meeting. And let me now move to our discussants, Laura von Daniels and Liz Nelson. So, sorry, apologies. So Laura von Daniels is head of the Americas division of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. She was previously assistant professor of political economy at the Central European University in Budapest, lecturer at the University of the Federal Armed Forces in Hamburg, postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, and research fellow in Princeton University. She holds a PhD in political science from the Freie Universität Berlin with statistical training at Columbia University in New York. Liz Nelson is director of the Tax Justice Network, where she leads a program of collaboration between tax justice and human rights in initiatives of practical application, including global researchers, advocates, and campaigners. She's a Senior Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity, which is a program at the International Inequalities Institute of the London School of Economics. And she, before being director of the Tax Justice Network, her career began in developing supported housing for vulnerable and marginalized people. Liz Nelson holds a master's degree in Victorian literature from University of Liverpool and postgraduate certificate in international human rights and development management from Open University. Ladies, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Angelos. Let me first start by thanking EPRS and Martin and Anceline in particular for inviting me and organizing this great event. And it's really a great honor to be part of this discussion with distinguished authors of the report and the participants on this panel. So my remarks focus on what the report does, in my view, and where it could even be improved, or in the process that follows this report could be perhaps improved, or there's some recommendations on how to spread the word about all the great results that you're presenting here. So I think what the paper does is it presents an excellent summary with all kinds of facts about CIT rates and basis and what it means to change them, and also on the role of multinational enterprises and FDI flows to and from Europe. And what it really means for public households. I think that became also very clear in the presentation when Erik de VRIJER was showing us the effects that rate changes or base changes can have. It also presents in a great chapter very helpful policy recommendations, and Alexander KLEMM just presented to us what those steps could be. So the report makes a very strong case that current international CIT, the framework as such, is outdated, and the report presents recommendations on rate coordination, minimum effective taxation of multinational enterprises. What it doesn't do, and I think here it could be more explicit, or in future versions of future presentations of the report, you could be more explicit or even more explicit about what EU and OECD processes mean. So are they entirely commensurable? Or are there trade-offs between CCCTB proposals of the European Commission and the OECD process? And where could those trade-offs lie? What do national governments eventually have to prepare for when they take decisions? And then also perhaps point readers a bit more, or listeners a bit more, to the political process. So where are we in the political sequence of events? What decisions will be coming up next? I mean, if you think of key strategic elections that are coming up in Europe, in Germany, in France, and other countries, you know, there will be potentially new governments having to take decisions on these very important issues. So maybe point policymakers or their advisors a little bit more on, you know, the timing of political decisions that should be taken sooner or later. And I think Paul Tang in the beginning said that this is a time of political change and of opportunity, and he was referencing President Biden's remark on taxation and international multilateral approaches towards improving the taxing system. And there's obviously this outward pressure coming from the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the need for governments to improve their revenue side. But there are also huge political challenges, and I think they're not as prominently placed in the report. There may be good reasons for that, and I think you can see it in the numbers. But you know, at least for readers or listeners in the future, I think it would be helpful to be even more open about the difficulties that countries will face, even within the EU 27, to coordinate on tax rates. To increase CIT revenue productivity, which is a point that you are explaining in the report very well, and it's really great and achieve. It's really helpful for readers, and it's approachable the way you describe it. I think you reach a broad audience, but you should probably make this more prominent. Also on how to deal with multinational enterprises. There are huge differences depending on what member of the European Union you talk to. So I think in the public debate in many countries in Europe, including my own, Germany, people are often quick to blame multinational enterprises for tax evasion, monopolization, for sort of ruining the information dissemination sphere, the digital sphere, and so on. But there are also other countries, and they have different interests. So if you talk to our neighbors in Hungary or Poland, or even in Luxembourg, UK, or Ireland, which is something you can see very well in your report, they have a quite different view of things when it gets to taxing multinationals, because they are so important for their revenue base, also for employment in the country. So another point, I think, is that as Europeans, we take at least some pride in the fact that 142 European multinational enterprises exist among the 500 largest multinational enterprises. So I think, you know, there's a lot to be done in the public debate to sort of make people understand what is at stake when you change taxes and rates and bases. So having said this, I think as a final remark, I think you could go on further, perhaps as one of the next book projects, Mr. KLEMM, to make more of a contribution on the political economy of implementing tax rates. So who gains and loses, depending on the current CIT rates and base definitions? Who will be likely veto players? And then look into national programs, perhaps even of the political parties that are now in the electoral campaigns. If you take the example of Germany, you see parties positioning themselves at this point. They're still quite vague on their preferences. They are all in favor of some global or European solution, but they're not very specific yet. But it would be interesting to find out more about where they place themselves, to then get a sense of, you know, where the political debate is headed for, and what are sort of roadblocks to achieving all of those great recommendations you have in the report. Of course, this goes way beyond what you were trying to achieve with the report, but just as a recommendation for further steps, or what you can sort of get out of this great report as a political message to policymakers. And with that, I end. Just one very final remark. Alexander KLEMM said that the CCCTB will affect countries differently. So a question that I would ask, if someone stated that, and if you're interested in implementing those recommendations, would be, could you find a way to show to people that the pie actually increases for everyone, even if there are different effects on different countries, and some are losing more than others, but is the pie as such increasing by implementing your reforms? Okay, thank you. And that's that for now. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you, Laura. So first of all, just wanted to thank the IMF and the European Parliamentary Research Service for hosting this event today, and to the authors of the paper on taxing multinationals in Europe, and obviously inviting me to join the discussion. So I'm really pleased to be here and really enjoyed reading the paper. And I found it incredibly lucid, and I have to say, on a personal level, the kind of explanations around some of the technical points, I think, you know, would do a lot to help people follow quite complex debates. So obviously this paper comes with against a backdrop of financial crisis and struggling economies, and as other people have said, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic, it's a really welcome contribution to the consensus on the state of the international tax system, and others have, and indeed the paper talks about this. And I just recalled it set out in the UN FACTI panel recommendations were also how we might, as a global community, replace the existing and failing global tax rules. So the EU adding to this consensus with this announcement, with this paper, and then announcements around the business tax system in the European Union are, as I say, really welcome. So I wanted to just focus my, you know, very, very brief comments on some points of alignment and divergence. And apologies, because I think some of these points have been raised, but I don't think it does any harm to underline them. And sort of those points and how they align with the tax justice agenda, and maybe not so much we part company, but we might want to push further. And I also wanted to do this through a lens of the area of work in which I'm engaged, namely tax justice and human rights and achieving equality, and importantly through an intersectional approach. And this is a really important point to engage with, because the design of the policies that we're all thinking about now and advocating for and researching about, these policies too often kind of fail to assess the impact on multiple issues and multiple people and the most marginal people. So the impact of the widespread tax avoidance practices on human rights include in relation to poverty and development and inequality is a notion that should be, and I think really is gaining much greater acceptance, as it has, you know, potential to stop undermining health and public services all around the world. So the kind of areas of alignment, I suppose, is the paper is really clear about the problems that are created by unfettered profit shifting, low corporate tax rates, the kind of subsequent tax competition, and this spillover impact. And it emphasizes the importance of coordination and cooperation within the EU bloc, and an approach to unitary taxation with a formula covering production factors and sales as a key to curbing that competition and mitigating that profit shifting. So where, in terms of kind of what might we diverge or some sort of differences? I think the concern remains about the scope, perhaps, and political ambition. I think the paper is really, if not visionary, it certainly sort of spells out a horizon of how we could make things different. But I think, unlike the FACTI panel, and I feel like it's important that I reference that, because it's such an important set of recommendations, that the IMF and the EU, I think, have stopped short of endorsing the kind of same push for a wholesale reform among lower income countries. And they, you know, the EU's BFIT reforms announced last week provide a really important, valuable model for other country blocs to follow and for global reforms at the UN. And I think we've seen that indication of EU support. But I think that the focus is, of course, is on Europe in the paper. But I think there's an opportunity for that corporate income tax remains, as it does, an important source of revenue. It's critical that for the advancement of basic economic and social rights, particularly in low-income countries, where the drains and the spillover have such a profound impact on revenue, that kind of that template, that design of the tax base is changed. So, and just to emphasize this point about why it matters, all countries, and especially low-income countries, must be part of and benefit from a design of the tax rules. The revenue that low-income countries are getting in their pot curtails the ability to provide social protection, welfare benefits, basic public services like health and education, which are real determinants of development. So the redistribution of taxing rights combined with the minimum effective rate provide the real kind of, you know, political space to realize economic and social rights. And of course, it is important, the curtailing of cross-border flows and profit shifting and tax competition means that low-income countries are likely to less rely on debt. And of course, you know, the IMF country recommendations to low-income countries continue to emphasize regressive consumption taxes as part of a deal that effectively kind of shackles them to debt obligations. So just very quickly now about some of the solutions. The Tax Justice Network last year published a report, the State of Tax Justice, and talked about the loss of revenue of 240 billion every tax year from multinationals' tax abuse. And that data comes from country by country data, and annually we will look at that data again and produce an update. But just the point, the current EU trilogue negotiations on public country by country reporting are a kind of case of point of maybe where the EU's not going far enough. Sort of failing to address wider implications of the rules. So the latest report suggests maybe that the EU will require public data on operations in EU member states and the marginal states on the non-cooperative jurisdiction list, which misses all the big profit shifting hubs. That will make the data much less useful for EU members and also completely, you know, much less effective and useful for lower income countries who will see their own data and that of non-EU tax havens simply aggregated as a single number. And why that matters is it's because of the public accountability that's lacking. So I just kind of I think in a way the report does very clearly talk about the need for a global solution, but perhaps the elephant in the room is about talking about what we would call for is a solution where there's a UN convention on tax. But the 3 points I would leave us on is that the solution has to be globally inclusive, and we have to have the kind of political courage and political integrity about addressing both in-country and between-country inequalities. It has to be unitary with a formally apportionment that goes beyond consumer and sales, and it has to be there has to be that minimum tax that probably has to be a lot more ambitious than the 15% proposed by the Biden administration. So I'll leave it there because I feel like I've probably gone over my time, and give a chance for people to ask questions. Thank you.
Let me thank once again Laura Fontanius and Liz Nelson for their discussion, for their comments. And let me remind participants that they can ask their questions once again. For the moment, we have two questions. One, which is directed, I see, to Laura Fontanius from Mr. Wisniewski. And I see the question is, what does Ms. Fontanius mean when she mentions Poland next to Luxembourg and Ireland when it comes to challenges with taxing multinationals? And the second question that we have, I guess it's directed to all panelists. It's the OECD Progress Report on Pillar 2 suggests that global shipping might be excluded from coverage by a global minimum tax. Would this be justified in your view? Let me give the floor to the panelists. I don't know who wants to intervene first.
I'm happy to start. And if okay, I would also like to react to some of the comments we received from our discussants, for which I'm very grateful. So thanks very much, both to Laura and Liz, for these very helpful comments. I think on the political process, I think this is absolutely right. It's an exciting topic. We should probably talk more about it. Of course, we are also limited in what we can say. One thing I wanted to point out in relation to that question is that actually they've been pretty well intertwined. So the European Commission published a communication in which they said that they plan to do a directive in order to implement the OECD pillars once they have been agreed. So you see very clearly how one is based on the others. But what we stress in this paper really is that it's nice, global is ideal, but Europe should not rely on this. And if it doesn't come to an agreement, it's better to do something at the European level than at a domestic level, even though global is what we all, of course, hope for. Laura asked this interesting question, does the pie increase for everyone? And I think it depends a little bit on what you mean by everyone, but if I think about the companies and the economies and the successful multinationals, then absolutely, it can be designed in such a way. So, and there are two reasons for that. One is you can think of this whole industry we currently have about tax advisors, people setting up structures, people coming up with clever evasion strategy as being a deadweight loss to the economy. So if all of that could be stopped, that's already a gain to the economy. The other aspect is that you can design a more efficient corporate income tax than the one we currently have. So tax competition is actually forcing it sometimes into directions that are not efficient, that tax normal returns in addition to rents and so on. One could move away from that if one had less pressure, if one could have higher rates and more efficient bases. So this is the other way in which one could have a gain to the economy, even though there would be more tax payment than there is now. I also wanted to react to various points made by Liz. So first of all, yes, I mean, I agree with many things on what you say, especially on the low-income countries. Today, we didn't stress them very much because today is about Europe, but as the IMF, very often we make these points that developing countries, they rely even more on corporate income taxes than advanced countries in relation to their total revenue. So for them, it's even more important. It's important for them that new rules are simple enough so that they can be implemented and enforced. And at the risk of becoming very technical, within Pillar 2, the ordering of the different mechanisms that are foreseen on the inbound and outbound is really important for developing countries. And it's important that a high weight is given to the inbound investment because they're usually the recipients of investment. So they should get a chance to collect tax from that. So I wanted to make one more point in relation to what Liz said, which is I agree very much on the importance of taxes for human rights and all of that. And I also think it's important for tax compliance more general. So if people have this perception that large multinationals don't pay, it might also demotivate them to pay their own taxes honestly. So therefore, it's really, I think it's really important that we collect it from everywhere. And Karin, then I wanted to respond maybe to the answer from the audience. Yes, I have not looked into the shipping sector. As a general rule, I would say, we should keep exemptions to a minimum and do them general and not sector specific, but at the control of having to really look into that sector and what the issue is. The beauty of a global agreement on anything is that you can do things that you cannot do when you approach them from a one country perspective. I should probably stop, and maybe Erik, you want to say something as well? I have probably talked too much.
No, thanks, Alex. I think you covered a lot of grounds. Maybe one thing on what Liz mentioned, which was our last slide. So this is sort of a paper on Europe. There will also be papers on Africa. There will be a paper on Africa, which will clearly have a bigger focus on low income and developing countries. This idea of a minimum tax, we mention it somewhere in the paper also, is very useful, because if you have a minimum tax on outbound foreign direct investment, then the recipient countries do not have to sort of tax profits. They have an incentive to sort of increase their taxation to at least that level, right? So that could help them as well. Yeah, I think this whole issue of the political process, that clearly is very important. Now, one reason why this paper has been in the pipeline for some time, but I think this is a good moment to come out with it, is because these ideas of we need to do reforms and minimum taxation and sort of how to deal with these cross-border spillovers. That's now, it seems that sort of there is more, we're closer to coming to some decisions or some sort of global, or at least European sort of agreement on something. And yeah, what we try to do in the paper is to sort of look at the facts and look at sort of the economic analysis part of it. What would also be feasible as reforms? You could imagine reforms in the corporate tax system that are very radical and completely start from a different point of view, like these destination-based cash flow taxes. What we try to do in our recommendations is to sort of make a useful step, important steps, but still not move too far away from the existing system. Let me stop there.
Andrew, so I might just add a point about the. I actually don't know a huge amount about the shipping sector, but I think two points I would flag up to just think about is the tax avoidance opportunities which come with the flags of convenience. And then the second thing, which I do think needs certainly from a tax justice point of view, need a lot more interrogation, is the kind of carbon emissions and the contribution that the shipping sector are making to that, and you might parallel that with the aviation sector. And so you'd almost argue that's possibly not the sector to be providing for exemptions to. But I just kind of throw those out to think about.
Angelos, did you want me to get back to those?
Yes,
to the
please.
question in the chat?
Yes, I have not seen any further questions, so if you could please.
Just briefly on Pavel Wisniewski's question in the chat, I was just referring to the 40% of profits of non-financial corporates in Hungary and Ireland originating from affiliates of multinational enterprises. And this is the case for 20% of profits in Luxembourg, Poland, and UK. And my point was just very simple, saying that given this fact, it's likely that it determines their taxing priorities differently than in other European countries. That was my whole point, and I think we often think of Eastern Europe, Central Europe as being a block of countries that is very much interested in keeping multinational enterprises as part of their domestic vibrant economy and not taxing them too much, but it also affects other countries in the western parts of the European Union. Just one more point on what Alexander KLEMM just said. You were mentioning that, you know, the processes are intertwined. You have the OECD waiting for the EU, and sometimes the EU waiting for the OECD process to develop further. And global is what we all want. That's true. I was referring to German party political platforms that I was just recently analyzing. And they all include sentences like that. But we also know from political processes that we're talking about different political priorities or opportunity costs, you might say. Whether you put all your efforts on the solution that Liz recommended, that we should really put more efforts into finding a UN-based solution. That's an entirely different process than trying to find sort of the narrow compromise, which is difficult enough to achieve among the EU 27 and perhaps some other neighboring countries who would then agree on that outcome. So there are trade-offs, I think, and I think it's important in the political debate to be very clear about those trade-offs and really set priorities. And it's also important for voters, for people to understand what these trade-offs are so they can make choices and not just stand there in front of different options they don't understand. And I think that's one of the responsibilities of politicians, of course, but perhaps also of reports like yours or future reports and presentations to point people really to the trade-offs that are connected to the different solutions. Thank you.
I react to that. So thank you very much. These are great points. So in one of our board papers in 2019, we have a little bit of a discussion on governance of these tax developments and the fact that there is no such thing as a World Tax Organization. And this is why you have this question, should it be done at the OECD, at the UN level? I mean, who should be in charge and what would be the preferred option and so on? Personally, as an economist, I'm not very well placed to discuss or to have a strong opinion on this. Trade-offs in terms of, you know, what measure has what economic trade-offs, that I think we can easily handle, or not, maybe not easily, but we can certainly handle. What is the best political path? I'm less certain. I would just draw attention to the fact that these are urgent things. So something that works, that gets to result, is preferable to something that is ideal, but might end up being a talking shop and not leading anywhere. But thanks very much for raising the point, and sorry I don't have, you know, the very clear answer on it. We will certainly keep thinking about that.
Given there are 5 minutes remaining, let me once again thank the participants, the speakers, and the discussants for a very, very lively discussion, very interesting topic, very interesting discussion. Let me take the opportunity quickly to mention that our next event is going to be held on the 1st of June at 1:30, and the title is the New EU-Roma Strategic Framework Towards Equality, Inclusion and Participation, with the participation of Vice President Livia Jaroka. And let me now give the opportunity to our speakers to make any last comments. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Well, all I have to say at this point is thank you very much for hosting this, for moderating it, for providing us feedback, for the audience to be there. It has been a great event. I was very happy to be part of that.
Yeah, I would like to second that, and we certainly hope that our paper with the sort of the facts and the analysis and the recommendations it contains, can make a positive contribution to the policy dialogue in Europe and in the European Parliament on where to take the corporate income tax system. And yes, of course, there is. It's a big political economy issue, so it's not only about sort of the economic effects, but I think at the moment, if you are going to make reforms, it would be best to sort of look also at the sort of the economic parts of it. Thanks.
Hi again. Yeah, very quickly to add that thanks to as everyone has done so far. I've really appreciated being part of the discussion, and it just feels such. And I think Alexander said this as well, and Erik. This feels such an important time, and quite a rare time for us to think carefully about both the economic but the political ways forward and how we do that for for our neighbours as well as for ourselves, and it just feels such an important time. So thank you.
Yeah, let me thank you as well. I couldn't agree more on what's been said, and I only want to add as a final remark, tax systems have always been political in the end. But we're now at a point, I think, in the international debate where it's a very salient topic now, and politicians should take that opportunity, I think, to get some things right and to really improve on a system or a framework that is not efficiently working anymore. So I think that was pretty much also what Paul Tang was referring to in the beginning, and from there, I think off we go and spread the word about your wonderful report. Thank you.
Again, thank you all. Thank you. It's the first time that I do it online, so I apologize. I would like to thank again all of you, and thank you also, Mr. Wolfgang HILLER, for the welcome. I guess that is the end of the event. That is officially the end. We're looking forward to reading all the further publications that are going to be published in the next, the existing ones from the IMF that were advertised during the event, and also further publications that will be published in the next few months. And we hope to have you again to discuss while the debate will go on the CCCTB, or another word for it, other initials. Thank you all.